Greetings and welcome back to Room 303 and our chats with Emily as we're calling our readings through the poems of Emily Dickinson contained in the Johnson edition. We turn now to poem 108. Surgeons must be very careful. And I find this a fascinating poem. When we get to poem 1063, there will be this line that says, "Ashes denote that fire was." This is one of those brilliant examples of how 4 lines, a little poem, can prove Emily so remarkable as an ironist, as a satirist. I find this little poem quite genius. And at the end of this little observation time, I'm going to point out what I've been saying for a while to you guys about the great poet T.S. Eliot. I think Eliot learned a whole lot from his study of Whitman and Emily Dickinson. And I made that comment about Whitman when I did all the poems of Leaves of Grass when we were doing Talks with Walt. Now we're doing Chats with Emily. I'm going to make an argument that I think we can tie a set of some of the most important lines that T.S. Eliot ever wrote back to Emily Dickinson. I'm going to try and do that. Now, our assumptions are that you've been following our stuff at learnstrong.net, down that left-hand side, Chats with Emily, our playlist. And I'm hopeful that you were able to already study with us the introductory set of comments, and then finally, I'm hopeful that you've been working through the preceding 107 poems. We just finished with To Such a Little Boat. Such a Little Boat. Our background information here is that Emily loved and followed the new science, no question, and the medicine as well. Although she herself had an interesting dance throughout her life in regards to doctors, especially eye doctors and the like. And because of that, she, I think, had at times a dubious feeling about the field of medicine. So as we look at this poem, we'll play that game of the surgeons, okay? So let's enjoy it. Poem 108. Surgeons must be very careful when they take the knife. Underneath their fine incisions stirs the culprit, life. Now, of course, this is a fascinating little ironic poem. I mean, we would expect her to say the culprit, death, right? Because that's what surgeons are asked to do. Now, we're going to see surgeons used 2 more times in her poems, in 177 and 1633. I love her use of 2 words in this poem, the word very and the word fine, because I think that's how she sets up her irony. This understated use of a word like very. Surgeons must be very careful when they take the knife, exclamation point. In other words, being a surgeon is dangerous business. Of course, right? In other words, one wrong move can lead to all kinds of problems, right? Underneath their fine incisions. Now, the word fine here can have, of course, that notion of a very minuscule kind of incision. But the word fine can also have an almost like ironic use for Emily. And I love to think that maybe that's what she's speaking of here. And then the use of the word stirs. Stirs, and notice it's capitalized, culprit, and then italicized, life, with another exclamation point. Now, I'd like to point out right away that she's making a self-evident observation, and when I've often found that when we read Emily's observations as self-evident, I'm guessing like Socrates and her love of Socrates, she's actually going elsewhere. She's basically, if you look at this at face value, she's saying, surgeons got to be very careful because obviously with one wrong cut or incision, they can remove the very thing they're trying to save, namely, of course, the life of the patient. But I'd like to think about the ways in which Emily, as I said in earlier lectures, is often writing about writing, talking about artists, talking about poets. And I think that her word surgeons here works rather nicely for our word poets. I think that what she's saying about surgeons is equally true of great artists. In other words, you got to be very careful as a poet to make sure that your incision is fine. That is to say, it's exact. Because if it's not, then there can be the removal of the very thing you're trying to save. Of course, in this case, life itself. Now, what can we do with a set of lines like this at 2a? Well, I think the argument that she's making is that life and art is a paradox. That life and death are both related. We think, obviously, of Lao Tzu and the Taoist tradition of the yin-yang symbol. I think their argument is that it is a fine line. Notice her use of the word fine. a fine line between life and death, or between creative product and loss of that creative product. In other words, the fragility of not only life as in real life, notice italicized, but the life of the artist as well, and the life of a poem. I love her word choice of very and fine and stirs. I think Emily does this kind of thing where she just throws one of these words out, and at first glance we don't take it seriously, and then we go, yeah, no, she's playing games, obviously, with her language. Now, the great Oxford scholar of Emily Dickinson, David Priest, has pointed out that in Hardy's Far From the Madding Crowd, that the shepherd, Gabriel Oak, will perform 49 successful perforations on sheep swollen by eating clover. However, quote, only in one case did he miss his aim, striking wide of the mark, end quote. And Priest is suggesting possibly maybe a connection between this set of lines and that. But I'd like to take us to the great poet Thomas Stearns Eliot. Now, of course, we've given full lectures on four quartets at learnstrong.net. You can run that to ground. And more importantly, East Coker, and more importantly, what Eliot said was the heart of Four Quartets, Part 4. Just listen to these lines and ask yourself if there's any resonances from the poem we just read. The wounded surgeon plies the steel that questions the distempered part. Beneath the bleeding hands, we feel the sharp compassion of the healer's art, resolving the enigma of the fever chart. Our only health is the disease if we obey the dying nurse, whose constant care is not to please, but to remind of our and Adam's curse, that to be restored, our sickness must grow worse. The whole earth is our hospital, endowed by the ruined millionaire, wherein, if we do well, we shall die of the absolute paternal care that will not leave us, but prevents us everywhere. The chill ascends from feet to knees, the fever sings in mental wires. If to be warmed, then I must freeze and quake in frigid purgatorial fires, of which the flame is roses and the smoke is briars. The dripping blood our only drink, the bloody flesh our only food, in spite of which we like to think that we are sound, substantial flesh and blood. Again, in spite of that, we call this Friday good. Now, Eliot said, as I commented on my lectures on this passage at learnstrong.net, that this was the heart of the four poems, those magnificent four poems that we call the Four Quartets. I think just having heard those lines, though, hear all the resonances from this little passage, I can't make a definitive connection. I can't tell you that T.S. Eliot read poem 108 and of Emily's collection and decided to write this famous passage, the wounded surgeon plies the steel that questions the distempered part. Read it again with me. Surgeons must be very careful when they take the knife. Underneath their fine incision stirs the culprit, life. Finally, at 3B, what was a time in your life when you learned about the fine line between life and death, between the production of a work of art and the loss of that work of art, the fine line that Emily's always dancing? Thank you.